In 2024, 50 people were sentenced to death in the United States. Of those, 25 had their execution suspended, while 25 faced their fate in 9 different states. Throughout this video, we will explore the crimes that led these individuals to death row, their last meals, and the final words they spoke before their executions. A look at the most shocking cases of the year. Welcome to Criminal Records. Kenneth Eugene Smith, State, Alabama. Kenneth Eugene Smith was convicted in 1989 for his role in the murder of Elizabeth Sennett, the wife of a preacher, in what was a contract killing for $1,000. Smith, along with an accomplice, brutally stabbed Sennett in her own home. His capture and trial led to a death sentence, though his execution was delayed for over 3 decades due to appeals and legal proceedings. On January 25, 2024, after 35 years in prison, Kenneth Eugene Smith became the first person to be executed using nitrogen gas, a method never before used anywhere in the world. In his final hours, he was visited by family, friends, his attorney, and a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, he chose a hearty plate, steak, eggs, and fries. When the time for execution arrived, Smith was secured to the gurney while witnesses observed from the viewing room. A mask was placed over his face, and as the flow of pure nitrogen was activated, his body began to convulse, a process that lasted several minutes. Finally, his breathing stopped, and his death was confirmed. Before he died, his final words were, "There is no justice in this." Yvain Cantu, State, Texas. In 2001, Yvain Cantu was convicted of the brutal murder of his cousin, 27-year-old James Mosqueda, and his fiancée, 22-year-old Amy Kitchen, a crime that shook Dallas. Prosecutors claimed Cantu shot both victims during a robbery attempt and then tried to cover it up. But for years he maintained his innocence, insisting he had been framed and had nothing to do with the murders. After spending more than 2 decades behind bars and making multiple attempts to overturn his sentence, Texas carried out his execution on February 28, 2024, by lethal injection. Unlike other states, where death row inmates can request a special last meal, Texas has a strict policy. Prisoners receive the same meal as everyone else. This rule was put in place after a previous inmate ordered an elaborate last meal and then refused to eat it. In his final moments, Cantu turned to the victims' families and once again declared his innocence. His last words were clear and firm. "I want you to know that I never killed James and Amy. I don't believe this will bring you closure." A few hours later, doctors confirmed his death. Willie James Pye, State, Georgia. Willie James Pye spent 27 years on death row after being convicted in 1996 for the brutal murder of Alicia Lynn Yarbrough. The victim, with whom he had an on-and-off relationship, was kidnapped, raped, and murdered in 1993. In addition to homicide, Pye was found guilty of kidnapping with injury, armed robbery, and burglary. DNA evidence and witness testimony led to his death sentence. In his final hours, Willie James Pye was given a large last meal. His tray included 2 chicken sandwiches, 2 cheeseburgers, a serving of fries, 2 bags of plain chips, and 2 lemon-lime sodas. He ate in silence. On March 20, 2024, Georgia carried out his execution by lethal injection. In his final moments, he accepted a prayer, but refused to leave a recorded statement. Staring at the ceiling, and without saying a single word, he received the lethal dose. Minutes later, doctors confirmed his death. Michael Dewayne Smith, State, Oklahoma. Michael Dewayne Smith was sentenced to death for a series of violent crimes that took place between 2001 and 2002 in Oklahoma City. In November 2001, he was involved in the murder of Otis Payne Jr. during a shooting inside a vehicle. While on the run, in February 2002, he broke into the home of 41-year-old Janet Moore and fatally shot her, mistaking her for her son, whom he was hunting down, believing he was an informant. Later that same day, he killed Sarath Puluru, a convenience store clerk, after mistaking him for someone else and blaming him for making offensive comments about his gang. During his years in prison, Smith followed a vegetarian diet. In the hours leading up to his execution, he broke from the tradition of requesting a special last meal, and instead ate whatever food he had left from the prison commissary. On April 4, 2024, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, he was strapped to the gurney. When asked if he had any last words, he responded with indifference, "Nah, I'm good." Brian Dorsey, State, Missouri. In 2019, Brian Dorsey was sentenced to death for the murder of his cousin, Sarah Bonney, and her husband, Benjamin Bonney, a crime that took place on Christmas Eve in 2006. That day, he called his cousin asking for money to pay off a debt to drug dealers. Hours later, he entered their bedroom while they were sleeping and, using a shotgun from the garage, shot them at point-blank range. After his arrest, he turned himself in and pleaded guilty. The sentence remained unchanged, and his execution moved forward. For his last meal before being executed, he was served a large feast consisting of burgers, fried chicken, fries, and pizza. Moments before receiving the lethal injection at Bonne Terre State Prison, Dorsey shared a farewell message through his lawyers. In his final words, he expressed deep remorse and took full responsibility. "To all the family and loved ones I share with Sarah, and to all the surviving family and loved ones of Ben, I am deeply, deeply, and overwhelmingly sorry. Words cannot contain the just weight of my guilt and shame. I still love you. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I regret hurting them, and I regret hurting you. To my family, my friends, and all those who tried to stop this, I love you. I am grateful for you. I have peace in my heart, largely because of you, and I thank you for that. To all those on every side of this sentence, I hold no ill will or anger, only acceptance and understanding." On April 10th, at 6:11 p.m. local time, the Missouri Department of Corrections confirmed his death. Jaime Ray Mills, State, Alabama. Jaime Ray Mills was sentenced to death for the murder of 87-year-old Floyd Hill and his 72-year-old wife, Vera Hill. Mills broke into the couple's home, where he brutally attacked them using a machete, a tire tool, and a ball-peen hammer. After the assault, he stole money and medication before fleeing the scene. Floyd died instantly due to blunt force trauma to his head and neck, while Vera survived for 12 weeks, but ultimately passed away from severe head trauma. In 2007, a jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. His appeals dragged on for years, but the courts rejected each attempt to overturn the conviction. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall called the crime cold and calculated, and stated that Mills deserved the punishment he received. Hours before his execution, Mills received his last meal, a seafood feast that included 3 large shrimp, 2 catfish fillets, 3 oysters, 3 onion rings, and a stuffed crab. On May 30th, 2024, the execution took place in the William C. Holman prison chamber in Atmore, Alabama. Present in the room were his lawyer, family members, and media witnesses. The prison warden read the death sentence before administering the lethal injection. Jaime Ray Mills did not offer any final statement before his death. David R. Hosier, State, Missouri. David R. Hosier was sentenced to death for the murder of Angela Gilpin in Jefferson City in 2009. The victim, a mother of two, had been in a relationship with Hosier while she was separated from her husband, Rodney Gilpin. But when she decided to give her marriage another chance and ended things with Hosier, he reacted with fury. Despite his conviction, Hosier always maintained his innocence, arguing that there was no DNA or physical evidence linking him to the crime. In his final statements to the Kansas City Star, he insisted that he regretted the deaths but said, "You can't show remorse for something you didn't do." Hours before his execution, he enjoyed his last meal: a steak with a baked potato, Texas toast, apple pie, milk, and orange juice. On the day of his execution, June 11, 2024, Hosier delivered a final message through his spiritual advisor. His last words reflected peace and acceptance. "I am the luckiest man on earth. I've been able to tell the truth about my innocence. I've been able to reminisce with my family and old and new friends. I've been able to become the fullest version of myself. I leave you all with love. Now I'm going to heaven. Don't cry for me. Just join me when your time comes." Ramiro Felix Gonzales, State, Texas. Ramiro Felix Gonzales was sentenced to death in 2006 for the rape and murder of 18-year-old Bridget Townsend in Texas. The crime took place in 2001, when Gonzales kidnapped the victim, sexually assaulted her, and then shot her, leaving her body in a rural area where it remained undiscovered for years. After his arrest, Gonzales confessed to the crime and was sentenced to death. Before his execution, Gonzales gave a final statement apologizing to Bridget Townsend's family. His last words were, "I cannot put into words the pain I've caused you, the pain I took away and can never give back. I hope this apology is enough. I lived the rest of my life for you, doing my best to restore, to make amends, and to take responsibility. I never stopped praying for your forgiveness and for the chance to apologize one day." The execution took place on the evening of June 26, 2024, at 6:50 p.m. Richard Norman Rojem, State, Oklahoma. Richard Norman Rojem Jr. was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of his ex-stepdaughter, Layla Cummings, in 1984. The girl disappeared on July 7th of that year, and her partially clothed, mutilated body was found in a field in Washita County, near Burns Flat. Investigators determined that she had been kidnapped, raped, and stabbed to death. Despite his conviction, Rojem always denied responsibility for the crime. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, leading to his death sentence. For nearly 4 decades, he filed appeals in an attempt to avoid execution, but none were successful. In his final hours, Rojem was granted his last meal: 2 small double cheese, double pepperoni pizzas from Little Caesars, 2 cups of vanilla ice cream, and a bottle of Werner's ginger ale. On June 27, 2024, in the Oklahoma execution chamber, Rojem was strapped to the gurney, an IV inserted into his left arm, where a visible tattoo remained. When asked for any final words, he simply replied, "I have none. I've already said my goodbyes." Moments later, the lethal injection was administered and his death was certified. Keith Edmund Gavin, State, Alabama. Keith Edmund Gavin was sentenced to death for the murder of a delivery driver in 1998 during a failed robbery attempt in Alabama. The victim was fatally shot when Gavin, acting in desperation, took his life without giving him a chance to defend himself. After his arrest, he was tried and found guilty. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against him, and he was sentenced to death. He spent 26 years in prison, while his attorneys filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. In his final hours, Gavin declined a special last meal, but accepted a serving of ice cream and a can of Mountain Dew. On July 18, 2024, in Alabama's execution chamber, Gavin was strapped to the gurney and connected to an intravenous line. His final words were, "I love my family." He then spoke a few phrases that, according to witnesses, sounded like Arabic. While speaking, he raised his hand, his index finger pointing upward, in a symbolic gesture. Moments later, the lethal injection was administered, and his death was certified. Arthur Lee Burton, State, Texas. Arthur Lee Burton was convicted in 1998 for the murder of Nancy Adelman, a mother of 3, who went for her usual jog one summer afternoon near her home in Houston. The next morning, her body was found in a wooded area next to the trail where she often ran. The investigation determined that Nancy had been strangled with her own shoelace and left there, abandoned in the woods. When questioned by the police, Burton initially denied any involvement, but later confessed to attacking her. Because of this, he was sentenced to death. On August 7, 2024, Burton was executed in Texas by lethal injection. Before receiving the final dose, he spoke his last words, expressing gratitude to those who had prayed for him, including some who didn't even know him. He also expressed deep regret for the pain he had caused, saying, "Bird is going home. To all the people I hurt and caused pain to, I just want you to know, I wish we didn't have to be here right now. But I want you to know that I regret putting you through this. I hope I find peace, and that you can too. Director, I'm okay." Minutes later, the lethal injection took effect, and his death was certified. Taberon, Dave Honie, State, Utah. Taberon. Dave Honie was sentenced to death for the murder of Claudia Ben, his girlfriend's mother, in July 1998. Court records state that Honie brutally attacked the woman inside her home and slit her throat, a crime classified as aggravated murder due to its extreme violence. After his arrest, Honie was taken to trial and sentenced to the death penalty. He spent 25 years in prison, exhausting every appeal without success. Utah, one of the states with the fewest executions in recent decades, hadn't carried out a death sentence since 2010, making his case highly publicized. In his final hours, Honie was given his last meal, a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. On August 8th, at 12:25 a.m. Mountain Time, Honie was pronounced dead after receiving a lethal injection of pentobarbital. Witnesses described how he tapped his foot against the ground, looked around, and gasped as the drug took effect. His body trembled momentarily, then went still. Before dying, he shared a message of redemption and change. From the beginning, if this is what it takes for you to heal, then let's do it. If they tell you you can't change, don't listen to them. To all my brothers and sisters here, keep changing. I love you all. Take care of yourselves. After his final words, he thanked Randall Honie and Bart Mortensen, the prison operations director and the warden, for taking care of his family. Loran Kenstley Cole, State, Florida. In February 1994, Loran Kenstley Cole and his accomplice, William Paul, brutally attacked John Edwards and his sister, Pam Edwards, while they were camping in Ocala National Forest, Florida. After luring them away from their campsite, they beat and robbed them. Then, Cole slit John Edwards' throat and assaulted his sister, leaving her tied to a tree. Pam managed to escape and alert the police, leading to the capture of both attackers. Paul pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison, while Cole received the death penalty. Cole spent 28 years on death row before being executed in Florida on August 29, 2024. Over the years, his case went through multiple appeals, but none were successful in overturning his sentence. In his final hours, he was given his last meal, a pizza, ice cream, M&Ms, and soda. When the time for execution arrived, Cole was strapped to the gurney with brown leather restraints, covered with a paper sheet up to his neck. A prison guard asked if he had any last words, to which he calmly replied, "No, sir." He looked up at the ceiling, then briefly lifted his head to glance at those who had come to witness his execution. He gave a slight nod, laid back, and waited. Moments later, the lethal injection was administered, and his death was certified. Freddie Owens. State, South Carolina. Freddie Owens, nicknamed Khalil, was sentenced to death for the murder of a convenience store clerk in Greenville, South Carolina, during a robbery in 1997. While awaiting trial in the county jail, Owens killed another inmate, strengthening the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. During the proceedings, his confession about the prison murder was read before two juries and a judge, who ultimately sentenced him to death. After spending 25 years on death row, Owens exhausted all his appeals. On September 20th, 2024, he faced execution. In his final hours, he received a large meal consisting of burgers, fries, a ribeye steak, chicken wings, strawberry soda, and apple pie. When the curtain of the execution chamber was drawn, Owens was secured to the gurney. His arms stretched out at his sides. He gave no final statement. As the lethal injection was administered, he exchanged a farewell glance with his attorney and offered a faint smile. His expression remained almost unchanged before he closed his eyes and his breathing began to slow. In the following minutes, his face tensed slightly, his breaths became shallower, until he finally stopped moving. His death was certified shortly after. Marcellus Williams. State, Missouri. Marcellus Williams was sentenced to death for the murder of Felicia Gale, a former social worker and journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who was repeatedly stabbed in her home in a St. Louis suburb on August 11, 1998. From his arrest to his execution, Williams maintained his innocence. During his years in prison, his case sparked debate and appeals, centered on the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime. However, all requests to overturn his sentence were denied, and his execution moved forward. On September 24th, during his final hours, Williams had a last meal of chicken wings and tater tots just before 11 a.m. He also received a visit from Imam Jalahi Kachem, who accompanied him to the execution chamber. Before receiving the lethal injection, he left a handwritten statement expressing his faith and acceptance of his fate. All praise is due to Allah in every situation. At exactly midnight, on September 24th, 2024, his death was certified. Travis James Mullis, State, Texas. Travis James Mullis was sentenced to death for the murder of his 3-month-old son, Aaliyah, in 2008. According to court records, Mullis, who was 21 at the time, lost control when the baby wouldn't stop crying. In an act of extreme violence, he stomped him to death, then abandoned his tiny body on the Galveston seawall, a popular tourist spot south of Houston. After his arrest, Mullis confessed to the crime, saying he had reached a breaking point the day he killed his son. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, spending 13 years in prison, exhausting every appeal without success. Before receiving the lethal injection, Mullis used his final words to express gratitude and apologize to his loved ones, including the mother of his child and the victim's family. He also gave a special message to those who supported him, both inside and outside of prison. I want to thank everyone, especially my friends, my pen pals, and all the people who stood by me in my best and worst moments, who accepted me as the man I became. On September 24, 2024, Mullis was executed in Texas, less than an hour after Missouri carried out the execution of Marcellus Williams. Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn, State, Oklahoma. Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn was sentenced to death for the murder of Kenneth Mears, a 31-year-old store clerk, during the robbery of the Root and Scoot convenience store in Oklahoma City in June 1992. According to prosecutors, Littlejohn and his accomplice Glen broke into the store to rob it, and Littlejohn fired the fatal shot at Mears. Over the years, Littlejohn maintained that he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. His lawyers argued that the prosecution used contradictory theories in separate trials, claiming in both cases that the defendant was the shooter, even though there was only one fatal shot. While Bethany received life without parole, Littlejohn was sentenced to death by jury decision. His legal team also pointed out that murders committed during a robbery are rarely punished with the death penalty, and that if he were tried today, he would likely have received a lesser sentence. On September 26th, hours before his execution, Littlejohn had his last meal: meat pizza, Coca-Cola, and 2 slices of cheesecake. When the final moment arrived, he was strapped to the gurney with an IV line in his right arm. He looked at his mother and daughter, who were present in the execution chamber. In his last words, he sought to comfort his mother. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm okay," his mother, Celie Mason, replied. "Everything's going to be fine. I love you." Minutes later, the lethal injection took effect, and his death was certified, marking the end of a legal battle that lasted more than 3 decades. Alan Eugene Miller, State, Alabama. Alan Eugene Miller was sentenced to death for the murder of 3 men in August 1999. Miller, who worked at Ferguson Enterprises, shot his co-workers Lee Michael Holdbrooks and Christopher S. Yancey multiple times before heading to Post Air Gas, where he killed his former supervisor, Terry Lee Jarvis. The attack was determined to be motivated by workplace resentment, as Miller had been fired months earlier. Throughout his trial and incarceration, Miller never showed remorse and maintained his innocence. He spent 24 years in prison, exhausting every appeal, before his sentence was finally carried out. In his final hours, he was served his last meal: a hamburger steak, a baked potato, and French fries. On September 26, 2024, Alan Eugene Miller was executed using nitrogen hypoxia, a controversial method never before used in Alabama. He was secured in the execution chamber, and a mask was placed over his face to administer the gas. Before losing consciousness, he spoke his final words: "I didn't do anything to be here." Minutes later, the flow of nitrogen deprived him of oxygen, and his death was certified, marking only the second use of this method in U.S. history. Garcia Glen White, State, Texas. Garcia Glen White was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of Bonita Edwards, 38 years old, and her twin daughters, Annette and Burnett, 16, in Houston, Texas in 1989. White, who frequented crack houses in the city, had a relationship with Benita Edwards and visited her on November 30th with the intent to do drugs and have sex with her. When Benita refused, White attacked her with a knife, stabbing her multiple times. He then went to the bedroom, where he sexually assaulted Annette, before stabbing and slashing her throat. Finally, he did the same to Burnett in the bathroom. On October 1st, 2024, Texas carried out his execution by lethal injection. While being secured to the execution table, White offered his last words directed at the victims' families. "I apologize and pray that you can find peace, comfort, and tranquility in your hearts for the wrong I've done and the pain I've caused to you and everyone else I've hurt. I regret all the pain I've caused." He also addressed the inmates and prison staff. "To all my brothers and sisters incarcerated, keep going, keep loving one another. To the administration and guards, thank you for treating us as human beings." Before he died, he thanked his family and friends. "Keep your heads up, stay strong. Once again, I regret all the pain I caused anyone. I just ask that you find comfort and close your hearts." Then, in his final moments, he began singing, "I Trust in God." At 6:56 p.m., his death was certified, marking the end of a story marked by violence and remorse. Derrick Ryan Dearman, State, Alabama. Derrick Ryan Dearman was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of 5 people, including a pregnant woman in Alabama in 2016. In a ruthless attack, he broke into the house where his ex-girlfriend was staying and killed 5 people, including the pregnant woman. From the beginning of his legal process, Dearman admitted his guilt, and in 2024, he withdrew all his appeals. In a letter sent to a judge that year, he wrote, "I am guilty. It's not fair to the victims or their families to continue delaying the justice they so rightfully deserve." Hours before his death, Dearman had the chance to visit with his children, sister and father. For his last meal, he enjoyed a seafood tray brought from a local restaurant. On October 17, 2024, in Holman Prison, he was strapped to the execution table, with intravenous lines placed in his arms. In his final words, he expressed his regret and apologized to the families of his victims. "To the victims' families, please forgive me. This is not for me, it's for you. I've suffered a lot." Finally, he addressed his loved ones. "To my family, I've said it before, you know I love you." At 6:14 p.m., the lethal injection was administered, and his death was certified. Richard Bernard Moore, State, South Carolina. On September 16, 1999, Richard Bernard Moore attempted to rob the Nicky's store in Spartanburg to fund his cocaine addiction. At the scene, he confronted employee James Mahoney, who drew a gun, leading to a struggle in which Moore managed to wrestle the weapon away and fire unsuccessfully at a witness, Terry Haddon. Mahoney pulled out a second gun, and the two exchanged shots. Mahoney shot Moore in the arm, but Moore shot Mahoney in the chest, killing him. Moore stole $1,408 before fleeing in his truck, but crashed into a telephone pole shortly after. Officer Bobby Rollins found him injured, and after he surrendered, Moore confessed to the crime. On November 1, 2024, after more than 2 decades in prison, Richard Bernard Moore was executed by lethal injection at the Broad River Correctional Institution. Before his death, he enjoyed a hearty last meal, consisting of steak, fried catfish and shrimp, scalloped potatoes, peas, broccoli with cheese, sweet potato pie, German chocolate cake and grape juice. In his final words, Moore expressed regret for the pain he caused the victim's family and shared a message of love for his loved ones. To Mr. Mahoney's family, I deeply regret the pain and sorrow I caused you. To my children and grandchildren, I love you and I'm so proud of you. Thank you for the joy you've brought into my life. To all my family and friends, old and new, thank you for your love and support. At 6:24 p.m., his death was certified, marking the conclusion of a case that had remained in the judicial system for over 20 years. Carrie Dale Grayson, State, Alabama. Carrie Dale Grayson was sentenced to death in 1996 for the brutal murder of 37-year-old Vicky DeBlue. In 1994, Grayson and 3 friends, all teenagers at the time, picked up DeBlue while she was hitchhiking. Soon after, they attacked and brutally murdered her. While Grayson, at 19 years old at the time, received the death penalty, the other 3 co-defendants, all 18 years old, avoided execution after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled to ban the death penalty for minors. Hours before his death, Grayson rejected his breakfast and lunch meals, but accepted a final meal consisting of soft tacos, beef burritos, tostada, French fries, guacamole, and Mountain Dew Blast. On November 21, 2024, at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility, Grayson remained defiant until the end. When prison warden Terry Raybon asked if he had any final words, he responded with an insult. "Yeah, sure, you should go to hell." Authorities turned off his microphone as he continued speaking. Moments later, the nitrogen gas began to flow. Grayson violently shook and let out a brief scream. At 6:14 p.m., his legs lifted in the air for about 30 seconds before returning to the gurney, and his fists remained tightly clenched until he finally stopped moving. The Alabama Department of Corrections dismissed his physical reactions as an exaggeration, stating that, in their opinion, the initial movements were pure theatrics. His death was eventually certified, closing a case that took nearly 3 decades to fulfill. Christopher Leroy Collings, State, Missouri. Christopher Leroy Collings was sentenced to death for the kidnapping and murder of 9-year-old Rowan Ford in Stella, Missouri, on November 3, 2007. According to his confession, he took her from her home while she was sleeping and brought her to his trailer, where he assaulted her before taking her life. Despite several appeals, his conviction was upheld, and on December 3, 2024, he became the 4th inmate executed in Missouri that year, and the 23rd nationwide. In his final hours, Collings was served his last meal, which consisted of a cheeseburger with bacon, breaded mushrooms, tater tots, and a chef's salad. Before his execution, he left a written message in which he accepted his fate and offered an apology. "Right or wrong, I accept this situation as it is. To all those I have hurt in this life, I ask for forgiveness. I hope you can overcome this moment and move forward." He also dedicated a few words to those who knew him. "No matter what side of this situation you're on, you're in my prayers, and I hope to see you in heaven someday." After receiving the lethal injection, his death was certified. Joseph Edward Corcoran, State, Indiana. Joseph Edward Corcoran was sentenced to death for the murder of his brother James Corcoran, 30 years old, and 3 of his friends, Robert Scott Turner, Douglas A. Stillwell, and Timothy G. Bricker, all around the same age. The crimes occurred on July 26, 1997, at the house he shared with his brother and sister. Since his conviction in 1999, Corcoran systematically refused to appeal his case, despite his attorneys arguing for years that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and persistent hallucinations and delusions. In the months leading up to his execution, his defenders attempted to stop the procedure, citing his mental state, but all attempts were rejected. Hours before his death, Corcoran requested his last meal, a Ben and Jerry's ice cream. On December 18, 2024, in Indiana's execution chamber, he was asked if he had any final words. His response was brief. "Actually, no. Let's get this over with." A few minutes later, the lethal injection was administered, and his death was certified, closing a case that had sparked controversy due to his mental health history. Kevin Ray Underwood, State, Oklahoma. Kevin Ray Underwood was sentenced to death for the 2006 murder of 10-year-old Jamie Rose Bolin in Purcell, Oklahoma. According to his confession, he lured the young girl to his apartment, where he struck her with a cutting board, suffocated her, and committed horrific acts which prosecutors said were part of a disturbing fantasy. His crime was uncovered when authorities found Jamie's body in a plastic container inside his home. On December 19, 2024, Underwood was executed at 10:14 a.m. at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Before his death, he chose a large last meal and declined the presence of a chaplain in the execution chamber. In his final words, he expressed regret for his actions. "I would like to apologize again for all the terrible things I did. I hate that I did those things and wish I could take them back."